sound echoed across marble floors like a gunshot. "Keep my granddaughter's name out of your filthy mouth." "Did you come to serve appetizers again, Charity?" The entire ballroom laughed. But Charity didn't blink, because she already knew something they didn't. Christopher leaned closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really thought you belonged here?" He raised his glass, and that's when it happened. The sound echoed across marble floors like a gunshot. "Keep my granddaughter's name out of your filthy mouth." The laughter vanished instantly. Christopher froze, because standing behind him was the one man no one in the city ever crossed. But here's what makes this worse. Christopher thought the cane was the threat. It wasn't. The real danger had just stepped through the doors. And by midnight, Christopher's empire would no longer be his. If you enjoy intense Korean Mafia stories like this, subscribe now for new episodes every week. "Grandpa, it's okay," Charity started, reaching for his arm. "It is not okay," Elvis barked, his eyes locked onto Christopher like a hawk. He stepped right into Christopher's personal space, making the younger man stumble back and nearly spill his scotch. "I've been watching you, Christopher. You're wearing a $5,000 suit, Christopher, but you still smell like a coward. In my world, we don't bark at women, we bury the men who do. You think that navy suit makes you a man? You think mocking a woman who builds things with her bare hands makes you powerful?" Elvis let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Look at him. He's terrified of a woman in a yellow dress because she shines brighter than his entire family tree. You didn't leave her because she wasn't society enough, boy. You left her because you knew you'd always be a footnote in her story." Christopher's face turned a deep, humiliated purple. He opened his mouth to retort, but the sheer weight of Elvis's presence silenced him. The power in the room had shifted, and the gala hadn't even truly begun. Christopher tried to pull his shoulders back, desperate to regain his footing as the crowd leaned in, their faces a mix of shock and twisted amusement. "Old man, you're making a scene," he hissed, his voice cracking just enough to betray him. "Security is one phone call away. Don't ruin what's left of your family's reputation by acting like a senile fool." Grandfather Elvis didn't flinch. He planted his cane firmly between Christopher's expensive Italian loafers and let out a laugh that sounded like gravel grinding together. "My reputation? Son, my reputation is built on 50 years of honest sweat. Yours is built on a deck of cards that's currently catching fire." He turned his body slightly, addressing not just Christopher, but the entire circle of socialites who had been snickering only moments ago. "You all want to know why this boy is so loud tonight? Why he's trying so hard to make my Charity look small?" Elvis pointed a thick, steady finger at Christopher's chest. "It's because he's a failure. He spent 18 months trying to run his father's real estate firm into the ground, losing the West Side contract because he was too busy buying sports cars to read the fine print. He didn't leave Charity because she wasn't elite. He left her because she was the only one smart enough to tell him his business plan was a joke." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Christopher's fiancée tightened her grip on his arm, her eyes darting around the room as the whispers shifted from Charity's dress to Christopher's bank account. "I know about the foreclosures, Christopher," Elvis continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the room. "I know your investment group is just a fancy name for a pile of debt. You stand here mocking a woman who feeds 300 families a week through her foundation, while you can't even pay the lease on this ballroom without a signature from your daddy." Charity felt a strange heat rising in her chest, not the heat of shame but the warmth of being truly seen. She watched as Christopher's arrogant mask crumbled, his skin turning a ghostly shade of gray. He looked small. For the first time in years, he looked exactly like the person he had tried to make her feel like. "You wanted a show?" Elvis asked, his eyes blazing with a protective fire that made the security guards at the door hesitate to step in. "Well, here it is. My granddaughter is the best thing that ever happened to you, and the biggest mistake you ever made was thinking you could dim her light to make yourself look brighter. You're not a lion, Christopher. You're just a loudmouthed cub who's about to lose his den." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of someone's champagne glass clinking against a tray. Christopher stood paralyzed, the weight of 100 judging eyes finally pressing down on him. Christopher's face went from pale to a frantic, blotchy red. He looked around the ballroom, seeing the smirks that were now directed at him instead of Charity. The finance bro charm had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, ugly mean streak. He snapped his fingers toward two large men in suits standing by the arched entrance. "Security, get this delusional old man out of my sight." Christopher shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched panic. "He's harassing the guests and making threats. Take him and his granddaughter to the curb where they belong." The two guards hesitated for a split second, looking at grandfather Elvis. They saw a man who didn't look like a delusional senior. They saw a mountain that wasn't ready to move. As they stepped forward, Charity felt a surge of fear and reached for Elvis's arm, but he didn't budge. Instead, he slammed his heavy oak cane down onto the marble floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. "Don't you take another step," Elvis warned, his voice low and vibrating with a power that made the guards freeze in their tracks. He didn't look at the security. He kept his eyes locked on Christopher, who was now hiding behind his fiancée. Elvis tilted the cane forward, barring the path like a gate made of iron. "I'm not going anywhere until this boy learns how to speak to a lady." The ballroom held its breath. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of a fork, but nobody moved. "I said get him out," Christopher screamed, his bravado turning into a tantrum. "Do you know who I am? I'm the host of this event." "You're a tenant in a house you can't afford, Christopher," Elvis countered, his chest rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic calm. "And right now you're going to apologize. You're going to apologize to Charity for every lie you've told about her work, and you're going to apologize for thinking you could insult my blood and get away with it." One of the guards cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, please, we don't want any trouble." "Then tell your boss to find his spine and give the lady her due," Elvis snapped, his grip tightening on the polished wood of his cane. He stood his ground, a lone protector in a room full of people who were used to buying their way out of trouble. Charity looked at her grandfather, his shoulders broad and his head held high, and for the first time in years, the weight of Christopher's shadow didn't feel so heavy. Christopher looked at the guards, then back at the crowd that was now recording the meltdown on their phones. He was cornered, and the silence of the room was screaming for him to make a move. Christopher's fiancée, a woman named Tiffany who had spent the entire night looking at Charity like she was something stuck to the bottom of her shoe, finally stepped forward. She smoothed her designer silk dress and let out a sharp, jagged laugh that set everyone's teeth on edge. "Enough of this theater," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary pity. "Christopher, stop arguing with these people. Look at him, honey. He's wearing a suit that's older than most of the guests here. It's probably a polyester blend from a clearance rack in a neighborhood we wouldn't even drive through. You can't expect class from people who think expensive means a new pair of church shoes." She looked at Charity, giving her a slow, mocking once-over. "And you, sweetie, you really should have stayed in the shadows. This world isn't for people like you. It's for those of us who actually have a legacy to protect." Grandfather Elvis didn't look angry. Instead, a slow, dangerous grin spread across his face, the kind of smile a wolf gives right before it strikes. He leaned slightly on his cane, his eyes narrowing as he looked Tiffany up and down. "A legacy, you say?" Elvis's voice was lower now, but it carried to the back of the room. "That's a funny word coming from a girl whose grandfather used to sit on my porch every Sunday afternoon. Yeah, I remember Arthur. We called him Artie back in the day, before he found a way to skim those construction funds from the City Bridge project in '84. The color drained from Tiffany's face so fast it looked like she'd seen a ghost. She opened her mouth to speak, but Elvis didn't give her the chance. "You talk about old money like it's something holy," Elvis continued, taking a slow, heavy step toward her. "But I know exactly where your family's money is buried, Tiffany. It's buried under the broken promises Artie made to the men who actually did the work. I was there when he begged me to keep his secrets. I was there when he was one bad night away from losing everything. So don't you dare stand there in your borrowed pearls and talk to my granddaughter about class." He looked at her designer dress with a look of pure disgust. "You're wearing a house of cards, girl. And you're lucky I haven't decided to blow it down yet. Now, unless you want me to start naming the offshore accounts your daddy is still hiding from the tax man, I suggest you take your legacy and find a corner to hide in." Tiffany stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat. The crowd was no longer just whispering, they were buzzing. The high society elite were suddenly looking at each other with suspicion, wondering whose secrets Elvis would reveal next. Charity watched as the two people who had tried to humiliate her suddenly looked like children caught stealing from the cookie jar. The air in the room felt electric, like a thunderstorm was about to break. And right on cue, the heavy doors at the entrance began to groan open. The heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. The rhythmic thud of the music died out completely, replaced by a silence so heavy you could hear the frantic fluttering of Tiffany's breath. A cold draft swept through the gilded hall, cutting through the scent of expensive perfume and old secrets. Standing in the doorway was a man who didn't belong in a room full of people who pretended to be powerful. He was the kind of man who actually was. Ye-joon stood tall, his charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. Beside him stood a younger man in a sharp gray suit, the one the streets called the Gray Enforcer, whose eyes scanned the room with the clinical precision of a shark. Christopher, still red-faced and trembling, tried to puff out his chest one last time. Finally, "Security, why aren't you?" The words died in his throat. The two guards who had been ready to lung at grandfather Elvis didn't just stop. They practically tripped over their own feet trying to get out of the way. They didn't look at Christopher. They didn't look at the gala hosts. They stared at the floor, their hands clasping behind their backs in a universal sign of submission. Ye-joon didn't look at the guards. He didn't even acknowledge the hundreds of wealthy donors staring at him in frozen terror. His gaze moved across the room, past the crystal centerpieces and the fake smiles, until it landed squarely on Charity. The ice in his expression didn't melt, but it shifted, turning into something fierce and possessive. The Gray Enforcer stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade. "I believe there was some talk of escorting someone out?" He looked at the guards who looked like they wanted to vanish into the marble floor. "Is there a problem here that requires our attention?" "No. No problem, sir," one of the guards stammered, his voice 2 octaves higher than it had been a minute ago. "We were just leaving." Ye-joon walked forward. Every step he took seemed to reclaim a piece of the room for Charity. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, people literally stumbling over chairs to avoid being in his path. Christopher was shaking now, his hand trembling so hard that his scotch sloshed over the rim of his glass, staining his navy sleeve. Ye-joon stopped when he reached grandfather Elvis. For a long, tense moment, the two men, the old lion and the new king, stared at each other. Then Ye-joon gave a slow, respectful nod. "Grandfather," Ye-joon said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that carried a hidden edge of steel. "I hope I haven't kept you and my wife waiting too long." He reached out and took Charity's hand, his fingers warm and steady against her skin. He turned his head just a fraction to look at Christopher, and in that moment, the ex-fiancé looked less like a man and more like a ghost. Ye-joon didn't just stand there. He occupied the air around them, turning the heated ballroom into a walk-in freezer. He kept Charity's hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm, his thumb tracing a slow, calming circle over her knuckles. The silence was so thick you could hear the distant muffled sound of a car horn outside, yet inside, not even a jewelry chain clinked. He turned his head toward grandfather Elvis. The hard, jagged lines of Ye-joon's face softened by a fraction, a sign of respect that everyone in the room noticed but no one dared to comment on. "Grandfather," Ye-joon said, his voice low and steady, like the hum of a powerful engine. "You've done more than enough. Thank you for standing guard over the queen while I was delayed. I'll take it from here." Elvis leaned back on his cane, his chest still heaving slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. He looked at Ye-joon, then at the way Charity was leaning into him, and a small, satisfied smirk touched the old man's lips. He gave a single sharp nod. "About time you showed up, son. Some people here seem to have forgotten who they're talking to." Ye-joon's gaze finally slid over to Christopher. It wasn't a look of anger, it was the look a homeowner gives a termite. Christopher was sweating now, actual beads of it rolling down his forehead and soaking into his expensive collar. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. "I overheard a conversation about charity cases and neighborhoods not worth driving through," Ye-joon said, his voice deceptively smooth. He took a slow step toward Christopher, forcing the younger man to stumble backward into a dessert table. A plate of macaroons clattered to the floor, but nobody moved to pick them up. It's interesting to hear a man talk about wealth when he's currently 3 months behind on the interest payments for his family's primary estate. Pulled out a single cream-colored envelope. He didn't toss it. He held it out, waiting for Christopher's trembling hand to take it. "My wife doesn't come here to beg for scraps from people like you, Christopher. She comes here to decide who is worthy of her time. And looking at this room, the list is very, very short." He turned back to Charity, his eyes completely ignoring the rest of the world. "Shall we remind them who actually owns the ground they're standing on, or should we let them enjoy their last few minutes of pretending?" Charity looked at Christopher, really looked at him, and realized the man she used to fear was nothing more than a shadow. She squeezed Ye-joon's arm, her voice finally coming back to her, clear and strong. "Let them wonder for a little longer, Ye-joon. I want to see him try to finish his speech around the room." Tiffany, who had been so loud just minutes ago, looked like she wanted to melt into the shadows. Ye-joon reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a single cream-colored envelope. I want to see him try to finish his speech first. Christopher's hand trembled so violently that the cream-colored envelope rattled against his fingertips. He looked at Ye-joon, then at the envelope, his bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. Around the room, the friends who had been laughing at Christopher's jokes only minutes ago were now backing away, sensing the sudden shift in the food chain. What is this?" Christopher stammered, his voice thin and reedy. Ye-joon didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his cufflink, a slow, deliberate movement that stretched the silence until it felt like it might snap. "That," Ye-joon said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register, "is the paperwork for the private equity loan your father took out 6 months ago to keep the family firm from collapsing. You remember that silent partner, who stepped in when every bank in the city turned you down?" Christopher's eyes went wide. He tore open the envelope, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. As he scanned the documents, his face went from blotchy red to a sickly, translucent white. "The Phoenix Group," Christopher whispered, his knees buckling slightly. "A subsidiary of my organization," Ye-joon clarified, stepping closer until he was looming over the man who had dared to mock his wife. "You've been spending my money on these expensive suits, Christopher. You've been drinking my scotch and hosting my gala with funds that were meant to keep your family's legacy alive. But there's a small clause on page 4. It says that the lender has the right to demand full repayment if the borrower's conduct brings reputational risk to the partner." Ye-joon leaned in, his eyes cold and dark as a winter midnight. "Insulting my wife is a very, very high risk. And I've decided I no longer want to be in business with a man who doesn't know how to keep his tongue behind his teeth." Grandfather Elvis let out a sharp, booming bark of a laugh. "Sounds like the bills come due, boy. Hope you've got some change in those pockets." Christopher looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single person to stand up for him. But Tiffany had already retreated to the bar, and the donors were busy checking their own phones, pretending they didn't know him. I need time," Christopher pleaded, his pride finally shattered. "You can't just do this. Not tonight. Not in front of everyone." "It's already done," Ye-joon said, his voice flat and final. "The wire transfer for the full balance is due by midnight. Since I know you don't have it, my legal team is already filing the paperwork to seize the estate. By sunrise, you won't even own the shoes you're standing in." Ye-joon turned his back on Christopher, dismissing him as if he were a piece of trash left on the sidewalk. He looked at Charity, his expression softening into something deeply human. "I think we've stayed at this party long enough, don't you?" Christopher looked like a man watching his own funeral while he was still breathing. He stood there, clutching that crumpled envelope, his mouth hanging open as his friends literally stepped over his shoes to get away from him. The silence in the ballroom wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, filled with the collective realization that the king of the mountain had just been shoved off the cliff. Grandfather Elvis stepped forward, his cane clicking against the marble with a newfound rhythm. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked like he'd just been given 10 years of his life back. He reached out and snatched a full glass of champagne from a passing waiter's tray, holding it high so the gold liquid caught the light of the chandeliers. "Attention. Everyone, look at this boy." Elvis's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings and stopping the last few whispers in the room. He pointed the stem of the glass toward Christopher, who was now leaning against a pillar just to keep his knees from buckling. "I want you all to take a good long look. Because tonight, you're learning a lesson your daddy should have taught you." Elvis took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the floor. There's a big difference between being rich and being wealthy. Being rich is what Christopher here was, flashing a watch he didn't earn, wearing a suit he hadn't paid for, and thinking he could look down on a woman like my Charity because her hands actually know what hard work feels like. He turned his gaze to the crowd, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. Wealth isn't about the zeros in your bank account. It's about the people who stand behind you when the lights go out. It's about honor. It's about knowing that when you walk into a room, you don't have to pull someone else down just to feel tall. Elvis turned back to Ye-joon and Charity, his face breaking into a grin that was pure, unfiltered pride. "So, I'd like to propose a toast. To the new management. To the man who knows how to protect what's his, and to the woman who was always too big for this small-minded room anyway." He drained the glass in one go, then set it down on the very table Christopher had nearly knocked over. The crowd, sensing the change in power, began to clap, hesitantly at first, then louder, until the applause felt like a wave crashing over Christopher's head. Ye-joon didn't join the applause. He simply leaned down, whispering something into Charity's ear that made her smile. A real, genuine smile that didn't have a trace of the old pain left in it. He guided her toward the exit, his hand firm on the small of her back, while Elvis followed close behind, his cane tapping out a victory march. Behind them, Christopher slumped into a chair, a ghost in his own house, finally realizing that the Charity case he'd mocked was the only thing that had ever truly been worth holding on to. 3 months later, the morning sun felt different. It wasn't the harsh, judgmental glare of the ballroom chandeliers, but a warm, honest heat that settled over the fresh brick and glass of the new maternal health wing. The air smelled of cut ribbons, expensive coffee, and the kind of hope you can only build from the ground up. Charity stood at the center of the podium, her canary yellow gown replaced by a sharp, tailored suit that matched the gold of the commemorative scissors in her hand. She didn't look guarded anymore. The skepticism that had lived in her eyes for years had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable peace. She looked out at the crowd, not a group of snickering socialites but real people. Mothers holding their children, nurses in crisp scrubs, and the community leaders who had once been told their dreams were unrealistic. To her left, Grandfather Elvis stood as tall as a redwood tree. He wasn't leaning on his cane for support today, he was holding it like a scepter. He wore a brand new suit, one he'd picked out himself, and his chest was puffed out so far he looked like he might burst with pride. Every time someone walked by and thanked Director Charity, Elvis would give a sharp, satisfied nod, his eyes misty but his voice as booming as ever. "Told you, girl," he whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. Yellow wasn't just a color. It was a warning that you were about to set this whole city on fire. To her right, Ye-joon stood a respectful half-step behind her. He didn't have a phalanx of security today, just the gray enforcer, standing discreetly near the entrance. Ye-joon's charcoal suit was as sharp as ever, but his focus wasn't on the cameras or the reporters. His eyes were fixed on the side of Charity's face, a look of pure, undivided devotion that made the surrounding power players realize exactly where the real strength in this city lived. He wasn't the mafia boss today, he was a man witnessing the empire his wife had built with her own heart. Charity looked at the two men who had shielded her when she couldn't shield herself, then she looked at the building behind her. Christopher was a name she hadn't heard in weeks, a footnote in a story that had moved on to better chapters. Reports said he was working a desk job in another state, his family's legacy, sold off to pay the debts he'd racked up in his vanity. She gripped the handles of the scissors, feeling the weight of the moment. With one clean, decisive snip, the silk ribbon fluttered to the ground. The applause that followed wasn't a performance, it was a roar of genuine gratitude. Charity didn't look for approval from the elite anymore. She stood between the man who taught her how to roar and the man who taught her she was worth protecting, and for the first time in her life she knew she wasn't just a survivor. She was the foundation. As the dust settles on Charity's journey, the echoes of Grandfather Elvis's cane and Ye-joon's quiet power leave behind a truth far more solid than any marble ballroom floor. This story isn't just about a dramatic showdown. It's a masterclass in what it actually means to hold your own in a world that tries to make you feel small. The biggest lesson is one Elvis shouted for the whole room to hear. There is a massive gap between being rich and being wealthy. Christopher had the fancy suit and the expensive scotch, but he was standing on a house of cards built on other people's money and broken promises. He thought power was something you used to dim someone else's light. But real wealth is found in the people who stand by you when the lights go out. It's about honor, hard work, and having a legacy that doesn't crumble the moment someone starts asking for receipts. Educationally, the story shows us the power of quiet receipts over loud lies. While Christopher was performing for the crowd, Charity was building a foundation that actually fed families. She didn't need to bark to be heard, she let her work do the talking. It teaches us that you should never judge a person's worth by their palate or the price of their dress. Sometimes the person you're mocking is the one who actually owns the ground you're standing on. Most importantly, it's a story about the strength of a support system. Charity succeeded because she had a grandfather who taught her how to roar and a partner who reminded her she was worth protecting. It reminds us that we don't have to face our shadows alone. When you have a solid foundation of people who see your true value, you stop looking for approval from the elite and start building empires for the people who actually matter. In the end, Charity wasn't just a survivor of a bad relationship. She became the very foundation of her community.